international conferences and universities such as MIT and UC Berkeley. He has a master's in computer science and an experience spanning over 2 decades. So there is no doubt his Flutter wizard who have innovative frontiers of Serverpod. So today he'll be unveiling mysteries of Dart on the backend with Serverpod and what's new with version 1.2. So here we welcome Viktor.
So, oh, okay. No, you can hear me. All right. I'm going to have to stay pretty close to this. I'm Viktor Lidholt. I've been a software engineer for over 25 years. I've worked a lot with making computer games and built developer tools. When I lived in Silicon Valley, I worked at the Flutter team at Google. And since I left Google, I've started Serverpod, which is a backend for Flutter. But before we start, so there's so many of you who have taken... okay, I'm back. So many of you have taken a selfie of me today, so I figured maybe I can take a selfie of you. All right. All right, make some noise. Awesome, thank you. All right, so today I'm going to talk about Serverpod. And Serverpod is, we're doing basically what Flutter does for the front end with Dart for the back end. Bringing you like a unified experience where you can use Dart across your whole stack. I started this project almost 2 years ago. I released the 1.2 version early this year, and today I'm happy to announce that we are releasing a 1.2 version in release candidate, so you'll be able to try that out today. So first I want to give a quick overview of both the talk and the Serverpod. So I'm going to first talk a little bit how you get started with Serverpod and what it can do for you, and also show you some of the new features in 1.2. So Serverpod is really a complete solution for your backend. You write your server. You add methods to your server. We have a program that will analyze your server and generate the same methods in a client that you can use in your Flutter app. So it's when you call a server method from your Flutter app, it's like calling a local method. We also have great logging. So we have a visual tool for handling your logs. We have built-in caching. That's often like an afterthought when you're building a server, but we made it very easy to work with. So I'm going to show that a bit too. And we have a great ORM for the database, which makes it possible to both do database migrations, relations, and everything with sort of a Dart-first, type-safe, null-safe environment. I show that too. And then we pretty much cover everything else you need when you're building a server. You can do your file uploads to S3 or Google Cloud. We handle your authentication. You can sign in with Google, Apple, email, text messages. You can stream data. You can handle your tasks. So we have a task scheduling system. Basically, you can say you have a user who sign up to your service, and 1 week from now you want to remind them. You can just make a future call in Serverpod, and that method will be called 1 week from now, even if your server restarts or anything. We do health checks, so every minute you can check the status of all your services that you're using, and we can also deploy very easy to with Terraform scripts to both Google Cloud and AWS. So it's really a complete solution at this point. And And this is our visual logger called Serverpod Insights. It's a companion app that comes with Serverpod. I should also mention all this is open source, so you can use this. It doesn't cost you anything. And the log you can actually change the log settings while your server is running. So say you have a method call that is slow for some reason. You can log the slow calls. You can pinpoint the actual database queries that may cause this slow call. And they come with a stack trace. So you can just click that stack trace, and it will take you straight back to VS Code to that very line that was slow. I don't know if you've done this before, but it can be real hassle with other systems. I've been there. All right. Before we get started, I want to ask you a quick question. How many here before today have heard about Serverpod? Can you raise a hand? All right. So of you guys, how many of you have tried Serverpod? So it's a couple. So I hope next time I come here, 1 year from now, this will be all hands. OK? All right. So let's first start from the very beginning, how you install Serverpod. And before you can install Serverpod, you need to have Flutter installed. And Dart obviously comes with Flutter. And then you need to have Docker Desktop installed too. And we use Docker just for hosting your database when you work with that locally. You can technically use just the database, but it's a bit of a pain to set up. I don't know if any one of you have tried to set up Redis on your server, but it can be a lot of work. And from today, you can also install the 1.2 release candidate by 1.2.0-rc.1. So definitely check that out. The talk will be around 1.2. There are a few things that have changed, but everything is also backwards compatible. So next, when you have Serverpod installed, to create a new project, you just do Serverpod create and the name of your project, and you're all set up. And when you do that, it creates a folder or a directory called mypod, which includes 3 subdirectories, which are all packages for Dart. You have mypod client, mypod Flutter, and mypod server. In the server package, you have all your server stuff. So here you will add all your models and all your endpoints and all your methods on the endpoints. And then when you run a command called serverpod generate, it will generate the client. So you get all the client code generated for you. And the client is imported into the Flutter app, which is mypod Flutter in this example. So you really don't touch the my client much, but you instead work with mypod server and mypod Flutter. And to start the server, you go into the mypod server directory, and then you do docker compose app build detached. That will start a database and Redis. So Redis is optional, but if you're building a large-scale application, you probably want to enable it and take advantage of the caching and inter-server communication, possibly. And then you do Dart bin/main.dart, and that will start your Serverpod. And if it prints that it's listening on a couple of different ports, are all set. And Serverpod also comes with a sample Flutter project. So you just go into the Flutter and do a Flutter run. And I started it in Chrome here. And the simple app is just like a hello world app. You send a message to the server and will respond with hello, whatever message you sent to it. All right. So when you open your Serverpod projects the first time, it feels a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of folders because we have a lot of features, but there's really only a few folders that you will need to pay attention to. So we'll have a little bit of a quick look at those here. First, you have a config directory. There you have a password file with all your passwords. And you also have configuration files for your development environment, your staging environment, and your production environment. By default, it's set up to run locally in the development environment. Then there are two folders in the source folder. You have the endpoints, and that's where you place your endpoints and your methods. And then you also have the protocol folder, where you store your models. So in this sample project, it will come with some comments there. So if you look at these examples, it'll give you a really good starting point and explain exactly what's going on. So it's really only the endpoints directory and the protocol directory you need to change to get Serverpod running. But then there are tools for doing everything from deployments to migrations of databases and all that stuff that you have when you need it. All right, so anytime you change anything in those two directories, you need to run serverpod generate, and that will just build the client files and all the files that are required by the server to route your messages correctly. So first, I'm going to say a few words on how you set up your endpoints. And there are a few things you need to keep in mind. The first is that all endpoints needs to be in the endpoint directory, can also be a subdirectory of this directory. You need to extend the endpoints class, and the methods need to return a typed future, and the first parameter need to be a session object. The session object is a little bit special. It has a lot of information attached to it, so you will find things like access to the database, the cache, information about the call, so you can get all the HTTP headers and stuff if you need it. And this is an example. This is from the actual example when you start Serverpod. So you have an example endpoint. When you generate a code, the endpoint part of the name will be removed. And then we have a method called hello that returns a future of a string. It takes the session object and a name, and it returns just hello, whatever that name is. And to call this from your Flutter app, you just need to have access to the client library, and then you can do client.example.hello, and then you pass in the string, and just await it, and you get the result, which now will be hello world. That's how easy it is to connect to your server from the client. You can just add more endpoints. Sorry, it's breaking up a little bit. You add more endpoints and more methods as you continue to develop your app. But there is another component to Serverpod as well, and that is the serialization of data and models. And model files in Serverpod is defined in YAML, which makes them very, very short, and it's very quick to write this code. You place the models in the protocols directory of your Serverpod server, and whenever you change it, you just run serverpod generate. So we'll have a quick look at some of these classes too. So this is an example of a company. The class is named company, and it has a number of fields, like a string, a datetime, and the list of employees. And if you do it just like this, the list of employees will be stored as a JSON object in the database. So let's have a quick look on how we can actually save this in the database. If you don't add a database table to it, it will just be a model that you can pass between the server and the Flutter app. But if we add a table column, it will now also be accessible by the database, and you can save everything. And you can reference other, like all the basic dart types, bools, strings, but also other serializable models. So you can build really advanced things. You can use lists and maps here as well. So this is an example of how you insert this company. We create a company with a name and the founder date, and then the company has a field called DB, which contains all the database methods. So in this example, we're using the insert row method. There's also an insert method that can take a list of objects if you want to do a batch insert. and obviously lots of methods for finding your object. So we're going to have a look at those too. Yeah, I should mention here that if you insert something into the database, you always get an object returned, and that has a field called ID that's always added to any database object, and that contains the ID of the row that's used in the database. So if we want to find this same object again, we can just use the db find by ID and pass in the ID, and we will get that back from the database. But we can also do more advanced queries, obviously, because that's typically what you want to do when you use a database. So there's another method called find first row that takes the first row it finds for a specific query. And we have like a where query here that's actually passed in a builder of the query. And the reason we do it this way is because the T here, that stays for the actual table, it has access to all the columns of this database row. So you can get typed access to everything that's available. So here we can find the name and then use the equals method to check if it's my company. And if we piece everything together and create an endpoint with, we call it company, that returns a company that we find by name. We have the method called find by name, and it takes the session object first, always, and then the string as a name. And then we just return the first row we find where the name of the company equals the name you pass to the method. All right. And I had a few guys asking me out there before how you would do caching with Serverpod. So I figured this would be good to have in the presentation too. And caching is super useful. You may not need it like at the very start, but it can really reduce the cost of running your server, because the most expensive thing in your server setup is talking with your database. I mean, it takes, compared to like everything else you do on the server, it's like an order of magnitude slower and more expensive. So being able to cache that data and return it really fast, especially if you have very complex queries, or maybe you merge lots of rows or build more advanced objects, it's very smart to actually cache these. And you do that by creating a cache key. That's just a string that describes that query in a simplified way. So in this example, you have a company colon the name of the company, but it can really be anything there, as long as it's unique to that query. And then we can use the session object to access the cache. And there's a number of different caches in Serverpod. So we can use the local cache, or we can use a global cache. And if we use the global cache, we use a cache in Redis that can be shared across servers if we need to make sure that the cache is consistent. And we just try to get a cached object using the cache key. And if it's not null, we return it because we found an object, all good. If we haven't found the object, that's when we ask the database for it. And before we return the object in the method, we store it in the cache. And you can also store caches with like an expiry date, so maybe it's valid for a minute or an hour, or you can set a specific group if you want to invalidate many keys at once for whatever reason. So what else can you do with Serverpod? You can do authentication, so I'm not going to cover this today, but we have documentation and guides that cover all this. So you can authenticate users with Google, Apple, or build your own system. You can stream data if you want to do real-time communication. I'm going to show you a real-world example we can all try out at the end. You can schedule tasks that happen in the future. And you can deploy your server using Terraform, or you can host it yourself. Next, I want to talk about Serverpod 1.2, and this release is really special for us. We have spent more time building 1.2 than all previous Serverpod releases combined. So it's a really big update, and it really takes Serverpod to the next level. And to make sure everything is super stable, we even added 2,000 new tests. So there's lots of tests to make sure everything is very stable. And it also makes it easier for contributors to add new features and for us to move faster if we need to refactor code and stuff like that. So there are a bunch of really cool things we've added. We have added support for database relations, and I'm going to showcase this part a little bit later on. But this is a surprisingly advanced feature to build, but it's very easy to use. So we are happy to finally be done with that. We add database migrations that makes it possible to basically, when you add new models to your database or change your models, to automatically provide a path to update those. And you can also apply them. You can both get like an SQL query. You also have a way to apply them through Serverpod. We have a new apply migrations command that you can use to apply it. And we also have a new service mode in Serverpod. So you can apply the migration and then Serverpod quits if you just want to run it from a task, maybe through continuous integration. So that's also a really big feature we added. We have made huge improvements to the developer experience. We built a VS Code plugin that will actually, it has a language server, the model files, so you get live type checking and everything there. We also improved the CLI tooling, always returns correct exit, and the output is much better looking, and it's easier to see what's going on. And in fact, we added 60 other features here too, of various sizes, and over 100 fixes. So it's really a big update. And thank you. So I'm going to take a quick tour of the database relations we're adding. So you can do both one-to-one relations. So this is an example where you have a company and an address that you connect to the company. Or it can be one-to-many. We have a customer that have multiple orders. Or it can also be many-to-many, where two database tables can reference each other. So we have support for all this through our ORM. So let's have a look of how we thought when we built this. We wanted to make sure everything was strictly typed and null safe. That gives you great support when you write your code in VS Code, right? It's pretty hard to write queries in strings because you won't know until you run them if they will work. So instead, you get everything typed. You get like the full support of your editor when working with it. We wanted to make it Dart first, so you don't think as much in table relations as you will think in Dart types and lists, for instance. And we wanted to build it in a way so it's very performant. So we built it in blocks that also can continuously improve over time, but already it's very performant. So let's see how we do this in Serverpod. So this is an example from previously. We have a company and it has an address. So if you just have it like this, the address will be saved as a JSON object in your database. But if we want to reference another table, we add the relation keyword instead. Likewise, say we have a customer object has a list of orders. We can add the relation keyword to that, and it will create a one-to-many relation. So the first example here will be a one-to-one relation, and the second is a one-to-many. And let's have a look at what this looks like from the Dart side. So we have the find method for finding a number of rows in your database. You provide it a session object. So say we want to find all the companies in India. Remember, the countries are in the address here and not directly in the company name. But we can still use this strictly typed methods to dig down to the country's name. So we just check company dot, that's the table, company table, sorry, and its address. And we know that the address has a country and a name, and we can just check that equals India. And for this to work, we also need to add an include. And the query will still work and select the company, but to attach the address to the company, we need to add the include here. And next, let's have a look at how this works with a one-to-many relation, where we, instead of just having a single object, we have a list. So in this example, we have a customer that have a number of purchases. And the purchase is a relation, so you can see that's linked to the purchase model. And the way we will can look in the database here, we can use a query that selects all the customers that made more than 10 purchases. And then we can use the include to just include the top 3 purchases. So the include here is almost like a new find. So you can do another find, and you can also do this like in a nested way if you have complex queries. So that's actually pretty neat how you can do this all in Dart code with just the models defined in YAML files. So that's what I wanted to show of Serverpod 1.2 today. And I want to finish up with some pointers where you can go to learn more. Obviously, you can speak to me, but there's so many of you, so that will take a lot of time. So I will show you some cool things. We made a simple game called Pixorama. It's a multi-user drawing experience that's inspired by our place on Twitter. I don't know if you've seen it, but basically, all of you can draw in this app at the same time. And you can find that on pixorama.live. And the server part of this is a single page of code, so that's pretty neat. That's a fun demo. And obviously, you can go to serverpod.dev to find anything you need there. And to find documentation for 1.2, our pre-release, you go to docs.serverpod.dev/next, or you can also select it in the list. There's a next version there. And make sure to follow us on Twitter, X, ServerpodDev for Serverpod, or me at Viktor Lidholt. We also have a mailing list, serverpod.news. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. All right. Thank you. So, not sure how the questions work. Well, okay. So, there was a question about sockets, is that correct? Yes, so we do have support for WebSockets, so you can stream data. So that's like a complete solution for doing real-time communication. If you do want to chat, we have a module that's like a pre-made chat that you can just plug in both the Flutter code and the server code. So that's actually something I didn't mention here, but it's a really cool feature. We built Serverpod with a module system. So a module can be both server code, client code, and Flutter code. So you can basically build features that you just plug in both in your Flutter app and on the server, and it just figures out how to work everything together. So that is really hard to do, actually, with the database migrations and relations, because they need to be able to talk with each other and stuff like that. Yeah. Right. So there was a It was a little bit hard to hear, but the question was about hosting and if there's any free plans or. Yeah, so basically I think, I know AWS, if you have a free plan there, Serverpod will fit within that. But we're also building, that's not done yet, but we're building a hosting service for Serverpod, and that will have some sort of free plan to get started, and then when it grows, you probably will need to pay us something. But we'll make it very easy to get started with.
Hello. Yeah, so I had a question.
Ah, there.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask that how is it different than other backend other services, like there is AppWrite and there is Supabase and all that?
Okay, yeah, so I guess Serverpod is a replacement for Supabase or Firebase. I'm sure you can use them in parallel if you need, but it's like a complete solution for your backend. I think we covered most bases of the things you need to do. It was built for my own need. I built, before I made Serverpod, I was working on a news app, and I figured it was really hard to use two different computer languages, so I just built the backend in Dart. Yeah, I know, I'm a little bit of an overthinker sometimes, and over-engineering stuff. I also built an app for doing my slides, so yeah, that happened too.
Hello. So my question is, for using relations in Serverpod, either we are using like joins or subqueries?
Yeah, so it uses joins under the hood.
Okay.
I think we're going to also make it possible to either choose if you want to do a join or separate queries. For some queries, I think most it's faster to do the joins, but there can be specific cases where you may want to do separate queries. But right now it's like one big query for it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So my question is like, is there any support for the real-time database like Firebase have that we can resend the streaming and real-time database over here?
Yeah, so I didn't showcase that here, but if you check that Pixorama app, it will show you how to do the real-time communication. It's pretty easy. Basically, you just, any endpoint in Serverpod can handle real-time communication too. And it works with authentication, it works with all those other things in the Serverpod ecosystem. So you basically just pass any models between the client and the server through a stream. And we built like the Flutter libraries for this. It was actually much harder than one would think to make that work consistently on both apps and the web and everything. There are like different issues with different platforms there.
Okay.
And it can like reconnect and all that stuff is already made for you.
Thank you.
Hi, can we generate OpenAI documentation?
OpenAPI documentation?
Yeah,
Is that,
OpenAPI documentation.
so there's a pull request that's a guy is working on for OpenAPI support. So it's not quite there yet, but it's probably 70–80% done. So hopefully we'll have that soon. I mean, the whole API is sort of compatible with OpenAPI.
Thank you.
Hi, Victor. Here.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that. So I need to take that one.
Victor?
And then maybe pass the microphone.
All right. Let's say we have already a server running on different technology. And if we want to build a submodule using this, is there any way we can communicate in same cluster and all?
So I don't think there's like any automated path to converting your server. It depends a little bit on your setup. But typically, I mean, it's less code to write for the server generally than the app itself. So, but it may be easier if you're starting out new, obviously, to use Serverpod. But I know there are a couple of companies that have moved from Firebase to Serverpod because different reasons. Maybe they don't want the lock-in from Firebase, or can also be expensive for certain operations and stuff like that. And that being said, there's already, I should mention this, there's already like 4,500 developers in our community, so we're pretty big, and I know there's some really high-profile apps using Serverpod released. One is made for NHS that helps surgeons to take notes during operations. And, so it's not like a unproven system. It's you can build very serious stuff with Serverpod.
All right. I have another question. Like, any plan on NoSQL support?
Yeah, it's something we definitely want to do in the future, and I think we're doing it the same approach as we have with like the rest of Serverpod, making sure it works with the same models and you get everything type safe. But it's a pretty big project to do, but something we definitely want to do in the future.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
No, finally.
Does it provide request and response object? Just like in Node.js, there's a request response next.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
There's a request object in server. There are request object, response object, and middleware for next object. So in the request, I can check what the client is sending.
Yeah.
That object is available. Request object.
Yeah. So I mean, all that happens behind the scenes in Serverpod, but you really only need to think of it as method calls. But if you want to like handle errors, for instance, and have a different response code, what you can do with Serverpod, you can actually cast an exception. You throw an exception on the server. It can be serialized, and you can unpack it on the client, and it's thrown there. So that's a really cool way of, you know, instead of sending different codes back and forth, you just work with like native Dart objects. Obviously, it won't serialize any exception. You need to make sure it's a serializable exception that extends the Serverpod exception class. So it's not like any exception will be shown to the client, but you can use that as a method, for instance.
Okay.
So it's using a REST API, but it's also very seamless if you work with Flutter. It's just like calling methods, so you don't really have to worry about like all the underlying things.
Does it have support for post, get, put, everything? Request type, post, get, put. You didn't get it, right?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
There are some request type like post request, get request, put request. Just like in the website, if you want to send a form data, we use the post request.
So
Post request. HTTP post.
Post, yeah, it's just using post right now.
Yeah, it's just a post request.
It's just using, it's HTTP post.
Okay.
So we may add some other more efficient layer there in the future using sockets directly. Because HTTP may not be like the fastest way to communicate with the server.
Okay.
But it's good to have as a fallback because it works everywhere, right? So that's why we did it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, maybe
Hello.
I have a last question.
Is it open source?
Yes, it's all open source and free. So what we're planning to charge for is the hosting service that we're building. But you can already host it like on Google Cloud or AWS if you want to.
All right, thanks.
Hello, can we create a framework like Elasticsearch using Serverpod?
Yeah, I would think so. You can use any sort of databases that Dart has support for, so it's not limited to Postgres, but you will need Postgres to handle our logging and future calls and those features. We use Postgres for that. But in the future, we may have other adapters for, say, maybe SQLite, because that would be pretty cool. Then you could run Serverpod on a device even. So that's something you can't do today, but you need to have access to the database somehow.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Can we use it as a common server pod? Like if I want to use one server pod and I have designed one thing and I want to use it for one or more applications, is it possible? Like like we have a backend, right?
Yep.
A separate backend, and we make APIs, and we can use that APIs in multiple applications. So is it possible with that as well?
Yeah, of course. So you can just import the same client in multiple Flutter apps, and that will just work. So
Thank you.
easy.
So it's like Django for Dart, right? Hello, hello, hello.
Yeah, sorry. It's so hard to see. Sorry.
Yeah, so I was asking, it's like Django for Dart, right? Like Django is for Python, this is for Dart.
Yeah, in a way. I think we have done a few more innovations when it comes to like handling the ORM and making that really nice, and also the code generation part to make it like really seamless. But yeah, I mean, there are many other solutions in different languages that are similar to Serverpod, so it's not like we're the only option, but it's pretty much the only option if you want to use Dart in your whole stack, and if you're a Flutter developer, that's a huge win, I would say.
Yep, that's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have some questions here. So we have support for serverless. So that was the question, if we have support for serverless, and the answer is yes. So you can run Serverpod, for instance, on Google Cloud Run. So there are a few features that will not work in serverless mode. For instance, it won't be possible to do future calls, and there may be some other features that are not available, but 90% work. Yeah, and you can't have the big thing on serverless, I guess that's the serverless thing, is that you can't have a state on the server. So if you're doing, for instance, some sort of, say you make a multiplayer game, then that probably won't be a good solution. But for other applications, we're just grabbing and saving data, it's perfect. All right. Thank you.
So I see that this cannot be used with a Dart plus HTML because of server security context.
It can't be used with
HTML plus Dart.
Aha. So we have support for Flutter Web. That will work. But you had some other use case, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I want to build the whole website using HTML plus Dart, nothing else.
Okay.
So I want to integrate this thing. I want to get this client and use it.
So I think we need to look at that. That's something we haven't prioritized that, but we're also building. I mean, it's in a kind of rough format right now, but we have a web server in Serverpod that can like do regular web pages, and you get like all the nice things you have in Serverpod for that. So if you use that, for instance, that would be nice to be able to call actual Serverpod APIs too, but we haven't gotten around to doing that yet. But that's a good point.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. I think it's time for the next speaker.
Thank you, Viktor, for an insightful session.